1879, Anna Haining Bates went into labour. Standing almost 8 feet, it's no wonder her baby was also a shocking size. When her water broke, she lost 6 gallons of fluid. That's when the doctor came to a chilling realisation. Some people in history are larger than life, and in the case of Anna Haining Bates, also just very large. In fact, she was one of the tallest people who ever lived. It's 1846 in Nova Scotia. Anne Graham and Alexander Swan, 2 immigrants from Scotland, have just welcomed their 3rd child, a baby girl. But this was no regular baby. Some sources suggest that the newborn weighed 13 pounds. By the age of 4, she was over 4 feet tall and weighed more than 90 pounds, and by the time she reached the age of 15, she was 7 feet tall and still growing. Although it was never officially diagnosed, it was later determined that Anna was born with gigantism, which occurs from a tumour in the pituitary gland, which in turn releases excessive amounts of growth hormone. Individuals who live with gigantism grow very rapidly, and typically have a significantly shorter lifespan. But though Anna had been dealt a difficult hand, fate nonetheless had an adventurous life in store for her. Anna's family was sympathetic to her unique condition. When she outgrew her elementary school desk, her father built a larger one by hand to accommodate her needs. He also built her an extra large bed to ensure that she stayed just as comfortable as her 12 siblings. Unfortunately, he couldn't protect her from the outside world. As news spread of this giant little girl, people in Nova Scotia began to visit her family's farm in the hopes of catching a glimpse of her. Local newspapers began to publish stories, which only added to the increased interest. One paper even referred to her as an infant giantess. So, from an early age, Anna became a curiosity, and her family saw an opportunity. Anna's family needed some financial support. As farmers, they were certainly no strangers to putting their other children to work, and Anna was no exception. Since she kept growing, she frequently required new clothing and shoes that were especially expensive. To make more money, the family made the decision to put Anna to work by touring around local fairs as an attraction. Despite accusations that her family exploited her, most historians agree that they genuinely cared and ensured that she was safe at all times. Anna wasn't always touring in her youth. She often cared for her younger siblings and tried to occupy her time with reading and staying focused on other artistic interests. So, although her experience wasn't common, she did her best to have a normal childhood. She also harboured a very normal dream, but sadly, it was doomed from the beginning. Anna really wanted to be a teacher, but while staying with her aunt and attending school, she encountered new difficulties. She found the classrooms physically constricting because of her size, and of course, people often gawked at her and made her feel especially uncomfortable. This experience ended her teaching aspirations, but thankfully, greater things were in store. In 1862, she relocated to America and took a job in the P.T. Barnum Museum as the Nova Scotian giantess. There she received tutoring and learned how to sing and play piano. The museum offered her jaw-dropping opportunities, many of which were unheard of at the time. She received $23 a week in gold, the equivalent of $500 today. She was also provided a chaperone and given the ability to earn extra income from pictures sold of her likeness, Remarkably for the time, her contract allowed her to keep the rights to those images. During her tenure at the museum, Anna performed characters like Lady Macbeth and interacted with audiences in Q&A formats to detail her experiences as one of the tallest women known to man. This experience was largely positive for her, as she got to control her narrative instead of merely being a freak. It's 1865 and Barnum's museum is ablaze in one of the most spectacular fires New York has ever seen, and Anna is in the midst of it. The stairwell is ablaze and Anna, who weighs nearly 400 pounds, is far too large to fit through a window. Somehow, with the help of 18 people who carried her, she managed to escape. Heroically, she had helped others escape before her, and in doing so, almost doomed herself. By most accounts, Anna was intelligent and kind. As she met people on tours who were also physically different, she became fast friends and formed bonds with them very deeply. In fact, her magnetic personality allowed her to become friends with one of the most famous royals of the time. Anna became no stranger to travelling the globe. She made the rounds all over Europe and the United States. In 1863, she even befriended Queen Victoria while touring as an attraction in Europe, and the two became unlikely friends. Anna attracted many suitors. It's said that she received numerous proposals, but because of her career as a performer, she chose to decline those offers. It was difficult for her to ascertain whether someone was being genuine or just wanted her money. But then she met a man who made her believe in true love. No, not him, the big guy, yeah. While at a circus in Halifax, Anna couldn't help but spot Martin Van Buren Bates, a man who was also pushing 8 feet tall. Naturally, Martin spotted Anna too, and so did a promoter, which led to a few interesting developments in both her career and her love life. Anna married Martin in 1871 in London, after the couple fell madly in love and began touring together in the circus. In 1861, after Queen Victoria lost her husband, Prince Albert, she fell into a deep state of depression and grieved for the rest of her life. But her personal loss didn't diminish her appreciation for other people's love stories. In 1871, when word spread that Anna had found love, the Queen decided to do something special for her. She gifted her a bridal gown that was made of 100 metres of satin and 50 metres of lace and embroidered orange blossoms. Rumour has it that Queen Victoria arranged for the Bates' wedding to take place at the church of St. Martin in the Fields. Anna Bates returned to Buckingham Palace after receiving an invitation from the Queen to visit, and received a diamond ring. The bridegroom also received a gold watch. Together, the couple later went on to meet with the Queen at least twice more. A year after marrying, Anna and her new husband purchased a farm in Ohio and built a house that could accommodate their lofty statures. The main part of the structure had unique specifications like tall ceilings and wider doorways, with all of the furniture being custom built. But the couple decided to ensure that the back part of their home was of average size in order to suit the needs of both servants and guests. Anna was an animal lover. She disapproved of horse racing, and on her farm she made it a point to take in animals that had retired from the circus. In 1872, still newlyweds, Anna and her husband conceived their first child, but it ended in tragedy. On May 19th, a baby girl weighing 18 pounds died at birth. 6 years later, Anna became pregnant with a son. On January 18th, 1879, her water broke, and she reportedly lost 6 gallons of fluid. She was in for an extremely rough labour. As the hours passed, the doctor came to a disturbing realisation. Anna's baby was so big, the doctor couldn't fit his forceps around its head. To usher the child into the world, they placed a bandage around its neck and pulled. He was a whopping 23 pounds, and Martin later wrote, "He looked at birth like an ordinary child of 6 months." But tragically, this was another doomed birth. After just 11 hours of life, her baby boy had died. Posthumously, he received a Guinness World Record for being the largest newborn ever recorded. The loss of this second child took an incredible toll on Anna. She fell into a deep depression and no longer wanted to tour. She withdrew from social life to cope with her pain. Although she later attempted to tour with the circus again, she ultimately had to withdraw. Anna and her husband decided to live a quieter existence during the late 1870s. By the spring of 1880, Anna spent her time solely on the farm, and she and Martin became more heavily involved with the Baptist church. In 1888, after having struggled with tuberculosis and thyroid issues, Anna died from heart failure during her sleep, just one day before her 42nd birthday. After her death, Martin erected a monument on her grave to honour her. A year later, he remarried and moved out of their Ohio home so that his average-sized second wife could be more comfortable. However, when Martin died in 1919, he was buried next to Anna and their baby boy. To this day, Seville, Ohio continues to remember Anna and her husband. There's an exhibit dedicated to the couple with artefacts and information about their life together. In Halifax, there's also a museum dedicated specifically to the giantess, and some of her descendants are still involved in curating and guiding tours for visitors. Throughout her life, Anna was often presented and promoted as being more than 8 feet tall. In reality, she stopped growing before getting quite that large, but she certainly came close at 7 feet 11 inches. To further sensationalise the attraction it shows, the exaggeration of her height often became necessary and lingered in newspapers despite the inaccuracy. Records obtained from the British Library show posters from the days when Anna was touring. She was advertised as the largest woman in the world and received top billing over Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins, who were massive stars in London at the time. Anna's placement above them as headliner continues to serve as a reminder that she attracted crowds as large as she lived. When famous little person Lavinia Warren made appearances holding a large infant, everyone assumed she was the mother. They were so wrong, and the truth would have broken them. Lavinia Warren would go on to become one of the most famous little people on earth. As a baby, she tipped the scales at a healthy 6 pounds. Various sources say that she stopped growing either as a toddler or when she was 10 years old. We'll likely never know those early details, but we certainly know more about her condition today than people did back then. Warren suffered from proportional dwarfism, a pituitary gland issue. She had numerous siblings growing up, but only one who could empathise with her condition. Her younger sister Minnie also had proportional dwarfism, and the two formed a special bond. Warren never allowed her dwarfism to hold her back. At just 16, she became a school teacher. Standing at just 32 inches in height, however, it would have been easy to mistake her for one of her students. For proportional dwarves in 19th century America, work was hard to come by, so when one of Warren's cousins who owned a showboat in Mississippi offered her an opportunity, she knew she couldn't pass it up. The cousin convinced her to spend one summer on his boat, but there was a catch. She would be part of his Museum of Living Wonders. Warren's cousin saw the potential in turning her medical condition and tiny stature into big stacks of cold hard cash. He marketed her as the Lilliputian Queen to paying guests on his showboat. Warren danced, sang show tunes, and chatted with the guests who looked on in wonder. Warren found her tribe in her cousin's Museum of Living Wonders and stood out as the star performer. With the money rolling in, she didn't want to go back to her normal life and asked her cousin if she could stay on. Pretty soon, her reputation spread far and wide, and that's when she met one of the most powerful men in the business. In 1862, when she was 21 years old, Warren entered the big leagues. After just a few years on her cousin's boat, she attracted the attention of the famous impresario P.T. Barnum. Barnum believed that Warren, with her talent for singing, dancing and eloquence, would be a perfect addition to his own museum. Barnum already had other proportional dwarves on his books, namely two very eligible bachelors, George Washington Morrison Nutt, aka Commodore Nutt, and General Tom Thumb, real name Charles Sherwood Stratton. When Warren agreed to join Barnum's American Museum, she became part of a tiny but tumultuous love triangle. Barnum's New York-based museum turned out to be the perfect place for Warren to showcase her uniqueness. She became an immediate sensation, earning as much as $3,000 every day for the museum. But she wanted someone to share that success with. Partly because of her youthful looks, Barnum paired Warren up with the teenage Commodore Nutt. Even though he was 7 years younger, he became completely entranced the first time he laid eyes on her. Warren was less enthusiastic about her show partner. Despite his obvious affection for her, Warren never considered Commodore Nutt to be anything more than a nice little boy. However, for the sake of appearances, Barnum wanted Warren and Nutt to spark up a real romance. It became clear to Barnum that despite his efforts at playing matchmaker, Warren had no interest in Commodore Nutt. That's when Barnum introduced Warren to his most famous little performer, General Tom Thumb. Lavinia Warren and General Thumb were madly in love, and it was plain for everyone to see. But while everyone else celebrated the relationship between the two famous little people, one person fumed. Commodore Nutt refused to accept that he had lost out on Warren's affections and started a fistfight with Thumb backstage during one of their shows. Unfortunately, there's no footage of that, because film cameras hadn't been invented yet, but I still really looked. In a last-ditch effort to win over Warren's affections, Commodore Nutt attempted to crash one of her dates with General Thumb. Sadly, he was too late. General Thumb had just proposed to Warren, and she had said yes. With civil conflict ravaging most of the country, the news of Warren and Thumb's pending nuptials gave the entire country something to celebrate. The big day came on February 10th, 1863. In order to appease the eager public, Warren agreed to have an open wedding ceremony so that anyone could attend. And everyone who was anyone did. Warren walked down the aisle at Grace Episcopal Church in front of more than 2,000 guests, including many of America's 19th century A-list celebrities. Whereas she left the ceremony open to the public, Warren allowed Barnum to charge guests a whopping $75 to attend the reception. That would be about $2,000 today. Despite the hefty admittance fee, they still expected their guests to shower them with gifts. Warren and her new husband greeted their high-paying reception attendees perched upon a grand piano. From their vantage point, they had a spectacular view of all their devoted fans. The New York Times recorded the extravagant gifts, including jewellery from Tiffany's, a miniature billiards table, and most impressively, a carriage from Queen Victoria. The Times reported the next day that during the service, Commodore Nutt appeared sick with jealousy. In all likelihood, however, the Times story was idle gossip, as Nutt actually served in the wedding as Thumb's groomsman. Cute. For promotional purposes, Barnum had taken photographs of Commodore Nutt proposing to Warren's sister, Minnie, around the time of Warren's big wedding. The photographs led to speculation that the love triangle had expanded to a love square. In her autobiography published in the New York Tribune, she dispelled the notion that Commodore Nutt had gone from being her admirer to her brother-in-law. She chalked the whole misunderstanding up to the fact that the four little people had a close, friendly relationship, but that there was nothing romantic between Nutt and her sister. Following their lavish wedding, Warren and Thumb embarked on a whirlwind, worldwide honeymoon. One of their first stops, however, was right at home. Wanting to further distract the nation from the conflict tearing the country apart, then President Abraham Lincoln invited the celebrity couple to the White House. When Warren arrived at the White House, she received a warmer welcome than she was comfortable with. Without warning, President Lincoln, who was 6'4", leaned in and kissed Warren on the cheek. He further quipped, "Sometimes God likes to do funny things, and here you have the long and the short of it." Warren had no qualms telling her friends after the encounter that she considered Lincoln to be quite rude. 1 year after their wedding and tour, Warren returned to New York and Barnum's American Museum. Much to everyone's surprise, however, she and General Thumb didn't return from their travels empty-handed. Warren and Thumb posed for pictures and public appearances carrying a mysteriously large baby. The public interest in this latest little addition to Warren's family sent the public into a frenzy. In fact, the public was so excited that no one stopped to ask whether or not the baby actually belonged to them. As it turns out, the baby was not, in fact, Warren's. In a stroke of marketing genius, Barnum had borrowed the baby from an orphanage. For the first few months, Warren and Barnum pulled off their little charade perfectly. However, as the months passed, Warren pointed out that the baby was growing too much for audiences to believe that it was hers. So, she came up with a brilliant idea of her own. Before embarking on a cross-country tour, Warren hatched a bold, if a little Machiavellian plan. She proposed dispatching a representative to each town ahead of time. They'd be tasked with discreetly choosing an infant from the local orphanage to use as a prop during their show. After a day of basking in the limelight alongside Warren, they would return the selected baby safe and sound. Well, as safe and sound as an orphanage in the 19th century could be. Warren's plan worked better than even she could have expected. It ensured that their travelling troupe had a steady supply of small babies. They were able to maintain appearances while also alleviating the hassle of having a child in tow throughout their travels. But there is another, darker theory as to where these mystery babies came from. Wait, darker than this? One theory claims that Warren and Thumb did have a child of their own. Unlike Warren and Thumb, however, the alleged baby lacked the natural charm and photogenicity to become a star. As such, this theory suggests that they simply replaced their own baby in the photos with cuter little cherubs. Imagine being a baby that's too ugly for a circus. Another source claimed that the baby in Warren's early photographs was in fact her own. However, they replaced the baby after a few years, not because she wasn't cute enough, but because she wasn't, well, alive enough. Allegedly, Warren's and Thumb's only child, named Minnie after Warren's sister, died at the tender age of 2. There is some credit to this theory. In General Tom Thumb's obituary in the New York Times, it clearly states that Warren and Thumb had a child. The alleged baby, once again, passed away at just 2 years of age. However, various sources give various dates for the birth and untimely demise of Warren's mystery baby. Despite her love for children, Warren lived in constant fear of having any of her own. Because of her condition, she feared that childbirth would be too much for her tiny physique to bear, especially if she gave birth to a normal-sized baby. In a devastating blow, her sister Minnie proved her theory about the dangers of childbirth to be right. Warren's younger sister Minnie had also married another little person in Barnum's employ. No, not the forever lovelorn Commodore Nutt, but a Major Edward Newell. Minnie became pregnant with Newell's baby and managed to carry to term. Giving birth to a full-size baby, however, proved to be too much, and she and the baby died shortly after the ordeal. Devastated, Warren held her sister in her arms as she drew her final breaths. In 1883, Warren and Thumb found themselves at the Newhall House Hotel in Milwaukee. The local fire department described the hotel as a tinderbox where tragedy was just waiting to catch a spark. It was almost a fateful morning for the little performers when, at approximately 4 in the morning, the building became engulfed in flames. The Newhall House Hotel quickly became, as one eyewitness described it, a flaming straw stack. As the flames consumed the famous luxury hotel, Warren and Thumb found themselves trapped on the 6th floor. Dozens of other guests made the painful decision of jumping to their deaths. However, Warren's small stature saved her life. Being little people once again paid off for Warren and Thumb. With the tiny couple tucked beneath one arm and a firm grasp on his ladder with the other, a single firefighter carried both Warren and Thumb down to safety. It was a feat that wouldn't have been possible with 2 fully grown adults. Warren and Thumb survived the inferno at the Newhall House Hotel. As many as 90 other guests, including an associate of theirs, hadn't been so lucky. But the event took its toll on their health all the same. Writing in her memoirs, Warren stated, "The General never recovered from the shock of that terrible ordeal. Only months later, Thumb died from a sudden stroke." His sudden passing left Warren crestfallen. In her autobiography, she claimed that she had wanted to retire following Thumb's death, and that Barnum had coaxed her back into work. It's likelier, however, that Warren returned to performing in order to maintain her lavish lifestyle. But she would need a new sidekick. Don't worry, it's not him. A few years after Thumb's passing, Warren married Count Primo Magri, an Italian little person with a similar history of performing. Even though he was a few inches shorter than Warren's late husband, he had a higher rank. Allegedly, Pope Pius IX had given Magri the title Count, making him more or less actual royalty and making her, technically, a real countess. Warren continued performing with Count Primo Magri into the early 1900s. She even starred in a silent film alongside him, The Lilliputians' Courtship. Eventually, however, as the public learned more about the science of dwarfism, they lost interest in Warren and performers like her. Eventually, she retired to her hometown of Middleborough, Massachusetts, and opened up an ice cream shop. Warren died on November 25, 1919, at the age of 78. As she requested, she was buried next to Thumb, her first husband and true love. However, Thumb's tombstone was a massive obelisk topped with a life-size, albeit still small, statue of him. Despite her massive stardom and miniature stature, Warren only has a simple gravestone that reads, "His wife." Lavinia Warren's dwarfism made her rich and famous, and it also caused everyone to regard her as either a child or an attraction. But she never regretted her decision to join Barnum and cash in on her small stature. She said, "When asked if I don't get tired of this public life, I am wont to answer that in a sense, I belong to the public."
Myrtle Corbin was an American sideshow performer who shocked audiences with her 4 legs. In 1887, she started feeling pain in her left side. Corbin was pregnant, and that's when her doctors came to a chilling realization. When the Bee Gees wrote their hit song, More Than a Woman, they weren't thinking about Victorian-era Myrtle Corbin, but they certainly could have been. From the waist down, Corbin was actually 2 women. Through a very rare birth defect, she'd grown 2 sets of everything in the lower half of her body. What followed was a degrading career in circuses and freak shows, but don't get your tissues just yet. Josephine Myrtle Corbin was born on May 12, 1868 in Lincoln County, Tennessee. Even before her mother delivered her, doctors noted something unsettling about the parents. They both had the same blue eyes, fair complexion, and striking auburn hair. The doctors prepared themselves for a potentially unusual delivery, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. Corbin's mother's delivery of the baby was absolutely normal, but when they looked at the newborn child, the doctors were in for a shock. Due to a rare condition called epigys, Corbin had 2 pelvises. These started at the waist and continued down the rest of her body. Of course, 2 pelvises also meant 4 legs. Corbin's parents had never seen a baby like this, and they anxiously turned to the doctors for an explanation. The doctors had originally thought that the mother and father were relatives, but they soon found evidence that this wasn't the case. They came up with a second theory that was also about the parents. You see, the mother was almost a decade older than the father. Today, this would mean nothing, but these doctors were grasping at straws for any reasonable explanation. Eventually, a new and even more outrageous theory emerged. Instead of seeing Corbin as a baby with 2 extra legs, some doctors saw it a very different way. They said that it wasn't that her body had separated into 2 parts. No, they thought that Corbin started out as twins. What had happened was that Corbin's twin sister only developed from the waist down. Clearly, no one really knew what had happened, but they did agree on one strange thing. Doctors assured Corbin's mother that even though she had a baby with a major deformity, the truth was that if the baby had had a breech presentation, the situation could have turned very tragic. With a baby of these 2 proportions, a breech birth would have been fatal for the child and maybe for the mother too. There was another surprising reason for mom and dad to feel happy about their new baby girl. In spite of her physical abnormality, Corbin was quite a healthy child. In fact, she was more than healthy. After an examination by a few local doctors, they said she was thriving and nursing well. She was a good size at the 3-week mark, weighing in at 4.5 kilograms, about 10 pounds. Everything, from the waist up at least, was perfectly normal. Sadly, there was something about her 4 legs that was going to be a major hardship for Corbin. As it turned out, Corbin didn't have 4 regular-sized legs. She had 2 strong legs on the outside and 2 smaller, weaker ones that hung between them. Unfortunately, the way the legs paired up didn't quite make sense. Instead of the strong and weak legs pairing together, each strong leg's partner leg was one of the weaker ones. If this wasn't bad enough, one of Corbin's so-called strong legs had a problem of its own. Corbin's 2 smaller, weaker legs did not develop enough to help Corbin walk. In fact, they were both much shorter than the strong ones and had only 3 toes. To add to her difficulties, Corbin had another problem. Her right strong leg had a club foot, which meant that it pointed inwards. For Corbin, walking was going to be a major challenge. But there was another even more daunting obstacle: dealing with people's prejudice. Doctors and scientists wasted no time in writing about Corbin and her unusual condition. Sadly, they were not kind in their descriptions. In one article, Dr. Brooks H. Wells said she belonged to the class of monsters by fusion. Dr. Joseph Jones cut the description short and just called her a living monstrosity. But name-calling wasn't enough. They were also guilty of a severe invasion of her privacy. In the name of science, some doctors began to write about things that were very private. They described in detail exactly what it looked like between Corbin's legs and even how she went to the washroom. The public was soon very knowledgeable about all things Corbin, and all this attention was turning her into a public figure. This gave her father an idea, one that would alter Corbin's life forever. The Corbins had to put food on the table, and soon were looking at their daughter as a source of income. A baby earning money? It sounds like a disaster in the making. When Corbin was just 5 weeks old, her parents saw a way to earn some more money for their struggling family. They invited neighbors to pay a small fee and then exposed Corbin's legs for their inquisitive eyes. To his surprise, William Corbin saw that his daughter could bring in some serious cash. Once all the neighbors had paid and gawked, the money tree dried up. That's when William took his idea to the next level. In an effort to make more money, William put ads in the newspaper to attract even more people. The ads showed a drawing of Corbin in her high chair with her mother standing beside her. Corbin is wearing a short dress, which allows easy visual access to her 4 legs. The newspaper reading public went absolutely crazy, and Corbin was now a national celebrity. William had the public where he wanted them, and now he had to deliver the goods. William Corbin moved the family to Blount County, Tennessee, and then packed up his daughter and left. Together, they embarked on a tour where he showed off his 4-legged daughter in sideshows and fairs across the country. It couldn't have been easy carting his daughter from place to place, but their need for money was paramount. The weeks soon turned into years, and there was no end in sight. Corbin then attracted the attention of a very important man, one who could change the course of her life forever. P.T. Barnum was a showman, a philanthropist, and a politician, but he was also a scammer. In fact, some say he was the original user of the phrase, "there's a sucker born every minute." Part of Barnum's nefarious business model was putting freaks on display, and Barnum wanted to meet Corbin. This meeting had big break written all over it, but Barnum was a scary man that they could not trust. Barnum later earned the reputation as the greatest showman, but his methods were far from ethical. Barnum would do anything for a buck, and it was clear that Corbin would not be safe in his greedy hands. Barnum met Corbin and her father, and he could not resist the money-making prospect of a girl with 4 legs. There was something more to her, though. Rather than being a shy, sad child with a deformity, she had a very upbeat and positive personality. Barnum was very pleased and saw great potential for Corbin. Next, it was time for negotiations. I'm not sure how much luck Corbin's naive father would have against the very shrewd Barnum. All those years on the road had apparently made William Corbin into a wise negotiator. After the meeting, Corbin walked away with a very healthy contract. Her weekly salary would be $250, equivalent to $7,000 today. Sure, the money was good, but now Corbin would be left in the hands of this very unscrupulous man. Corbin's performance for Barnum was really quite simple. She would appear on stage, looking quite normal in her long skirt. The only suggestion of anything different was that her hips looked wide for her body, and of course, her slight limp. Corbin would then sit down and slowly and dramatically pull up her skirt. When the audience saw her 4 legs, they were awestruck. Sounds like a pretty easy way to make a buck, until you factor in the horrible world that Corbin had to live in. Life as one of Barnum's freaks had the potential to be a nightmare for Corbin. Barnum used tortuous methods to train his animal performers. In fact, his minions literally burned elephants to make them behave. To earn her weekly salary, Corbin had to spend her time within the cruel world of P.T. Barnum. Unfortunately, Barnum's horrible treatment didn't stop with the animals. Barnum wasn't all that kind to his human performers either. One freak that Barnum employed was a man suffering from microcephaly, which meant that his head was smaller at the top. Barnum gave him the name Zip the Pinhead and billed him as the What Is It? Barnum heartlessly displayed Zip in a cage with monkeys and suggested he was the missing link. Corbin somehow survived the humiliation of working for Barnum, but she soon came to a depressing realization. Corbin soon grew tired of being a person who the public just liked to gawk at. To make matters worse, she had to stand by as her younger sister, Willie Ann, did normal things like go on dates and then plan a wedding. For Corbin, the dating world would present another challenge. As a woman with 4 legs, she would be facing an uphill battle. Due to Corbin's extensive travel with Barnum, she was actually quite a cultured young lady. She was also pleasant to look at and had musical abilities. When you add her whopping salary to this, Corbin was actually quite a catch. Various men, at least the ones willing to overlook her extra limbs, made romantic advances towards her. There was one big problem. Corbin didn't know if she could trust any of them. You see, Corbin's colossal salary turned many men into scoundrels. They saw the money and falsely showed romantic interest in her. Sure, some of them may have been sincere, but Corbin had no way to tell the honest ones from those trying to take advantage of her. Luckily, fate had a twist in store for her. In 1885, Corbin's younger sister was about to walk down the aisle. Willie Ann's groom was Hiram Locke Bicknell, and there was something about Bicknell that interested Corbin. He had a brother. Corbin assumed that she could trust James Clinton Bicknell, and perhaps hoped that a romance would begin. Choosing Bicknell was the easy part. Figuring out how to engage with him romantically was something she'd never done before. As it turned out, Corbin didn't have to use any of her charms to lure in Bicknell. He was already interested. What made Bicknell perfect was that he was about to be a doctor and clearly not in need of her freak show salary. 6 months after her sister's marriage, Corbin and Bicknell walked down the aisle and Corbin said goodbye to her work in freak shows. It was the end of an era, but something strange happened as soon as she quit. Corbin had retired from being a sideshow performer, which left a gaping hole in the industry. Her condition was very rare, so it wasn't like anyone would be filling her 4 shoes in the near future. And then the impossible happened. There was another 4-legged woman, and then another, and then another. It appeared to be an epidemic of women who had Corbin's same deformity. Clearly something fishy was going on here. As it turned out, this new group of 4-legged women all had one thing in common. they were all fakes. They shamelessly attached phony, smaller limbs that hung between their real legs. Corbin was still the original, an only four-legged woman. Well, you know what they say, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Corbin didn't have time to worry about these fakes. She had a new crisis on her hands. About a year after her wedding, Corbin's health began to suffer. She had a fever, headaches, and a pain on her left side. Dr. Lewis Whaley examined Corbin and discovered something that most women eventually encounter. Corbin was pregnant. Because she had two of everything from the waist down, the pregnancy was only on one side, the left. When Whaley told Corbin she was pregnant on the left side, her reply shocked everyone. What surprised Corbin was that her pregnancy was on her left side. The doctor was initially confused by Corbin's comment. Corbin didn't have to be indelicate and spell it out as the truth suddenly dawned on the doctor. When it came to bedroom times with her husband, she had a choice of sides, and it was the right. No one with Corbin's condition had ever given birth before. She had no choice but to go bravely forward with no idea what the outcome would be. Sadly, Corbin's pregnancy soon took a turn for the worst. She was now feeling very ill, and they summoned the doctor once again. Whaley examined Corbin, and they nervously awaited his professional opinion. When the doctor told them what he thought, Corbin and her husband realized it was the last thing they ever wanted to hear. A woman giving birth with Corbin's unusual condition was completely new territory, and the doctor had to rely on his knowledge, but also on instinct. Corbin was still very ill, so Dr. Whaley felt forced to make a tragic judgment call. 8 weeks after he examined her, he decided they had to terminate her pregnancy. Corbin likely wanted to mourn the loss quietly with her husband. Sadly, this is not what happened. The public had pretty much forgotten about Corbin, but when news of her pregnancy got out, there was a revival of interest. Doctors in the US and even abroad were once again writing about her condition in medical journals. It looked like Corbin was heading back to the humiliation and the name-calling that she so despised. The renewed interest in Corbin had the potential to once again put her on display as a freak. In fact, it was the opposite that happened. These new articles about her focused on what was normal about Corbin. They said she was attractive, intelligent, and capable of maintaining a household. Corbin was finally getting the respect that every woman deserved. After her loss, Corbin continued to try to get pregnant. It could be that she tried too hard. Over the next few years, she delivered 7 children. Sadly, only 4 of the children lived beyond infancy, but she eventually had a full house and was a successful parent. It was time for Corbin to forget about her days as a circus freak and focus on her family. You'd think this would be her happy ending. Nope, Corbin still had some surprises left. The next years of her life, Corbin spent raising her children. The family made a move from Tennessee to Texas, and there, the children slowly reached maturity. It was a quiet life for Corbin, living far from the spotlight and fame. Maybe it was too quiet, because Corbin's next move was rather unexpected. Some speculate that Corbin and her husband had fallen on hard financial times, but no one seems to know for sure. Whatever the reason, 20 years after the last time she'd put her 4 limbs out for public appearance, Corbin was ready to lift her skirt again. Wait a minute, this doesn't sound like the happy ever after that we all expected, but there was something very different this time around. Corbin was now in her 40s, and like a modern-day pop star, she was ready to take complete control over her act. This time there was no Barnum breathing down her neck. She was independent and even made her own decisions about her wardrobe. What she did worked, and her public performances were instantly popular. But Corbin was just getting started. The rebooted Corbin show was a big success, and she wanted to make it even more so. Corbin was soon lifting her skirt in places like Coney Island in New York, Riverview Park in Chicago, and even the Ringling Brothers Circus. Her weekly salary went from $250 when she was a young woman to a whopping $450 as an adult. Corbin was once again at the top of the game, but there was some serious competition coming her way. Francesco Lentini was almost 20 years younger than Corbin. He came from Italy to America and immediately started to wow audiences. Lentini's claim to fame was having 3 legs, and they were all of different sizes. Even more astonishing was that he could kick a soccer ball with one leg and use another as a stool to sit on. Lavinia was young, athletic, and charming. It was time for Corbin to take a second retirement. Sadly, it would not be a peaceful one. After years of her second spot of fame, Corbin started to slowly remove herself from the spotlight. After only a couple of years of rest and relaxation, Corbin was once again facing a very scary situation. Out of the blue, her right leg had developed a rash. She quickly called the doctor and fearfully awaited a diagnosis. Today, doctors could quite easily cure the skin infection on Corbin's leg with antibiotics. Sadly, back in 1928, they could not. A week after the doctor gave his diagnosis, Corbin was gone. It was May 6th, 1928, and she was just 59 years old. The good news was that now she would be able to finally rest in peace away from the public eye. Corbin's family was ready to lay her body to rest, but it could not be a conventional burial. They had to take the unusual step of covering her coffin in solid concrete. Even more surprising was that they had to have family members keep watch over the coffin until the concrete had become completely solid. It seemed like the family had become strangely paranoid. As it turned out, there was one very good reason for their concern. The family's concern was about something very macabre. They assumed that grave robbers would be chomping at the bit to get their hands on Corbin's very unique remains. In fact, some scientists and collectors had offered the family money to purchase her skeleton. It was, after all, certainly one of a kind. Well, it was one of a kind, at least until the 1990s. In the 1990s, a shocking wedding picture of one Ashley Bracel hit the tabloids. In it, Ashley was in her wedding dress with her 4 legs on display. When the headlines later pronounced that a skiing accident had taken her life, it became clear that this was just a hoax. Corbin's reign as the original 4-legged woman still remained. In 2015, poet Diane Seuss released a collection of poetry that she called 4-Legged Girl. The book used an image of Corbin on the cover, and Seuss says this was because she took inspiration from her. Seuss often thought that her life, like Corbin's, was an exhibit. It seems surprising that a Victorian-era 4-legged woman could inspire a modern-day poet. As it turned out, Corbin also inspired modern-day freaks. Corbin's second era in the spotlight had been as an independent performer, and this inspired some modern-day freaks. Places like Coney Island and Venice Beach have recently seen a revival of freak shows. Like Corbin, these freaks are the ones controlling the power of their uniqueness. They've even formed a union that offers them something unheard of in Corbin's day: retirement benefits. This advancement would have made Corbin insanely proud. In 2021, a shopper in Waterloo, Canada, came across what he thought was a heartless find. He was shopping in a craft store when he discovered images of Corbin used as Halloween decoration. The photo showed Corbin sitting pretty in her carefully matched socks and shoes. I guess to some backward thinkers, Corbin's image belonged with the ghosts and goblins of Halloween.
Although the famous Hilton sisters suffered the cruelties of life together, these conjoined twins didn't actually die together. Something much worse happened. From the very beginning, Daisy and Violet Hilton were doomed to a heartbreaking end. As conjoined twins, their rise to fame was synonymous with exploitation and prejudice. Poked, prodded, and called freaks by audiences everywhere, they grew up in a world void of love. Just when the tide began to turn, the Hilton twins faced their most disturbing chapter of all. Kate Skinner was a simple barmaid in Brighton, England, but in 1908 she found herself in a bit of a pickle. Unmarried and alone, she received some disturbing news from her doctor. She was pregnant, and with twins no less, but this was no time for celebration. This pregnancy shouldered Kate with a world of economic and moral dilemmas. Her baby's futures were terribly uncertain. Fast forward to the delivery day, and Kate found herself facing a problem she could have never imagined. After giving birth to her twin daughters, Daisy and Violet, Kate looked down and saw something she couldn't make sense of. She had expected to see 2 withering babies, but instead she made a disturbing discovery. Her darling daughters were attached. The doctors were shocked, but this wasn't exactly unheard of. Kate had given birth to conjoined twins. The doctor who helped deliver the Hilton sisters had to make an agonizing decision: leave them conjoined or risk their lives by cutting them apart. He decided to play it safe and left them as they were. Even though he did the cautious thing, it didn't stop him from giving Daisy and Violet a chilling prognosis. He told Kate that her babies wouldn't last more than 1 month. Daisy and Violet Hilton seemed destined to be close siblings. After all, they came out of their mother's womb in a remarkable way, joined at the hip and buttocks. But it was the early 20th century in England, and their mother was an unmarried barmaid. To put it mildly, it didn't look like these girls had even a slim chance of anything but a grim future. Daisy and Violet's mother wasn't at all prepared to deal with conjoined twins. What's more is that she harbored a horrible belief. Because she'd had her babies out of wedlock, Kate believed her twins were a punishment for her sins. More than anything, she wanted to escape her maternal responsibilities, and so she looked to someone she trusted, her employer, Mary Hilton. But this was a huge mistake. Kate's boss agreed to take Daisy and Violet under her wing. But if you're imagining a kind-hearted lady adopting these adorable girls in a charitable way, think again. You see, Mary Hilton didn't adopt the girls at all. Instead, she did something much darker than that. She bought them. Yes, Kate saw her babies as a pair of freaks and sold them. However, the horrors didn't end there. Mary Hilton took one look at Daisy and Violet, and all she saw was a money-making machine. She quickly moved the twins into a room above her pub and didn't waste her precious time. She exhibited the girls immediately. If you had your 2 pennies to pay, you could gawk at these conjoined twins. And the money, well, every cent went straight into Mary's very own pockets. Unfortunately, some of the gawkers wanted to do more than just look. While the Hiltons were ushering customer after customer into their rooms to see the twins, they weren't paying close attention to what was actually happening. Some of the curious customers went a little further than they should have in order to see the freaks up close. They actually reached into the bed and lifted the baby clothes. Once Mary saw what was happening, she put a stop to it. But this wasn't an act of mercy. No. She had even more evil plans for the twins. Mary Hilton saw that paying customers wanted to do more than just look at the girls. Instead of protecting them from the hands of grabby viewers, she decided to capitalize on the situation. So, in addition to the 2 cents customers paid to see the girls, you could pay a little extra to touch the place where their bodies met. Daisy and Violet say they remember 3 things from this period: the smell of smoke, brown ale, and strange hands pulling at their baby clothes. But it wasn't just the strangers these girls had to worry about. When it wasn't the customers manhandling the twins, it was Mary Hilton herself. If the girls made her unhappy for any reason, she whipped the girls with a belt, and not just the soft leather part. Hilton had cruelty flowing through her veins, often using the buckle of the belt to punish Daisy and Violet. And if Hilton wasn't around to mistreat the twins, there were plenty of others on hand to take over. Daisy and Violet watched from the sidelines as Mary Hilton betrayed her husband, entertaining numerous male suitors on the side. This did not bode well for Daisy and Violet. These strange men often tormented them just as much as Mary, causing the twins to live in constant fear of everyone they met. It wasn't long, however, before Mary decided to take her money-making twins on the road. By the time the twins were 3, Mary had already paraded them around Germany and even Australia. Mary was raking in the dough, hand over fist, but she wanted more. So, she set her sights on the ultimate prize, success in the United States. Their first destination was the slightly seedy San Francisco. The year was 1915 and the girls had just turned 8. However, there was something about Daisy and Violet that Americans just did not like. Hilton and the twins showed up at a port in San Francisco where they confronted a shocking situation. Hilton had assumed Americans would be more than happy to see her incredible display. I mean, how often do you get a chance to see conjoined twins in real life? Well, America was having nothing of it. In fact, the border guard denied them entry for one surprising reason. At the border, the guard said that Daisy and Violet were medically unfit to enter the United States. But Mary Hilton wasn't about to take no for an answer. She was desperate to get her twins onto the America's stage, hungry for all the money they would earn her. Unsurprisingly, Mary turned to manipulation, calling up several newspapers and raising quite a stir. The authorities didn't want a scandal on their hands, so they did the obvious thing. They let the Hiltons into the country. As soon as she got the green light, Mary put the girls to work, practically feeding them to the wolves. She didn't hold back. She wanted her girls everywhere, but Hilton wasn't content with just showing the girls. She wanted them to perform. Think about it. If you had your twin sister attached to your hip, what would be the most difficult talent to master? I'd say tap dancing would be up there in the top 10. Sure enough, Mary forced them to learn tap dancing, and it was straight up humiliation. Poor Daisy and Violet busied themselves with learning how to tap dance. When legendary comic Bob Hope found out what was going on, he did something completely heartless. He put them in his comedy routine, so not only were the girls trying their hardest to put on an entertaining show, but they also faced a crowd of jeering audience members. To the twins' dismay, no matter where they turned, not a single person had their best interests at heart. At this point, there was only one thing that could save the girls from their sad predicament, and it was just around the corner. While they were still in America, the twins' lives changed forever. Their owner, Mary Hilton, passed. While it was certainly bad news for Mary, it was good news for the twins. They'd been under Mary's complete control since they were born, and as they were teenagers, were probably desperate for some much-needed independence. But instead of independence, the girls just got more bad luck. You'd think that the passing of their owner would set the girls free, but that didn't happen. Like any other possession, Mary Hilton had included Daisy and Violet in her estate. So the twins ended up in the hands of Mary's daughter and son-in-law. If the twins had hoped for a better life, they were in for a rude awakening. Edith Myers and her husband were just as bad as Mary, if not worse. Edith and her husband, Meyer Myers, didn't have an ounce of compassion for their living, breathing inheritance. The girls were still held captive and brutally mistreated. The Myers family flayed the girls mercilessly whenever they misbehaved. When it came to capitalizing on Daisy and Violet, Edith Myers came to a stunning revelation. Having tap dancing conjoined twins on the payroll wasn't enough. So, she stopped the performances and made the girls learn something new: music. The Myers family forced Daisy and Violet to practice the violin and saxophone for hours each day. The music lessons were bad enough, but the threats began to reach an all-time low. Edith had complete control over the girls. She kept them mostly in confinement and rarely let them out. Maybe you're wondering why they didn't try to escape. Well, if they did try to leave the house or defy her in any way, Myers would lay down her ultimate threat. She threatened to place them in a mental institution. The girls were most definitely stuck. As long as they were earning money for the Myers, there was no way out. By the 1920s, when Daisy and Violet were teenagers, they were raking in about $5,000 a week with their show. This was a heck of a lot of money back then, but once again, the twins didn't have any control over their finances. Not only did the Myers take all of their hard-earned money, but the girls had no idea how popular they'd become. It didn't seem like Daisy and Violet could catch a break until they met a mysterious stranger. Through one of their acts, Daisy and Violet made the world-famous magician, Harry, Houdini. Harry was the one celebrity who had compassion for the girls. He saw that they were working hard and not getting a cent for it. The notorious magician took the girls aside and gave them some much-needed advice. What Houdini told the girls changed everything. What Houdini did for Daisy and Violet was quite simple. He told them to open their eyes. The girls had no idea how famous they were, and Houdini showed them newspaper after newspaper that extolled their popularity. With Houdini's advice and support, the twins, now in their early 20s, saw what they were, and more importantly, how much they were worth. It was finally time for the girls to spread their wings and fight for their freedom. So Daisy and Violet hired lawyer Martin Arnold in order to win their freedom from Edith and Meyer Myers. The twins brought a lawyer against their managers and demanded immediate emancipation. The judge didn't waste any time. He awarded them their freedom and something more, a whopping $100,000. In today's money, that's about $1,500,000. The girls could finally start a healthy and independent life, but it wasn't as easy as it seemed. Free from their captors, Daisy and Violet surprised everyone by returning to the stage. While I guess it was the only thing they knew how to do, but at least this time they would keep the money they earned. They hit the scene with the Hilton sisters review and even tried to differentiate themselves from each other. Daisy dyed her hair and they both started wearing clothes that didn't match. The twins were getting their first taste of independence, but they still had some hard lessons to learn. Freedom was obviously the best thing for the Hilton sisters, but there was a devastating downside. They now had to take care of themselves. Under the constant care and oversight of first Mary Hilton, then her daughter, the twins had never learned the basic skills of everyday life. Managing their money, keeping themselves well fed and healthy were now left totally up to them and them alone. With their dwindling finances, the girls needed to find a way to keep themselves afloat. Adulthood and independence were far more difficult than they ever imagined, but this was only the beginning. The public's interest in their shows, the twins' only source of income, was waning. In search of money, the Hilton sisters turned to a still new form of entertainment: films. In 1932, horror filmmaker and circus performer Todd Browning began searching for what most people called circus freaks to appear in a film about love and mystery under the big tent. The movie was Freaks, and it was ready, set, controversy. Some of the controversies with Freaks started long before it hit the theaters. It seemed that the other actors at MGM didn't want to eat with some of the stars of the film. To keep things calm at the studio, they built a table outside so the Freaks could eat away from the other performers. For some reason, Daisy and Violet didn't receive the Freak label and got to eat inside with the so-called normal performers. But that didn't mean there weren't any problems in the lunchroom. Since Daisy and Violet were eating in the lunchroom with other MGM employees, it was inevitable that they'd run into a few celebrities. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author of The Great Gatsby, wandered into the lunchroom one day and stopped abruptly in his tracks. His jaw dropped as he watched something disturbing take place right in front of him. What Fitzgerald saw in the lunchroom was none other than the Hilton sisters. But it wasn't just their appearance that made the celebrity author choke, it was what they were doing. As far as Fitzgerald could make out, it seemed that one Hilton was reading the menu, but somehow the other one was also taking in the information. Fitzgerald later said that the sight made him nauseous. Eventually, the film wrapped, but what would moviegoers make of this very controversial film? Once filming was complete, the Hilton sisters had to wait on pins and needles to see themselves on the big screen. Well, it almost didn't happen. Because the film depicted a side of life that filmgoers didn't really feel comfortable looking at, the movie received a complete ban in Australia, the UK, and in several US states. Strangely, some of the bans lasted a really long time. In the UK, audiences couldn't see the Hilton sisters perform in Freaks because authorities banned it not once but twice. It received a ban when the film first came out, then again in 1952. Authorities didn't lift the ban until 1963, which made it the longest ban on a film in UK history. In fact, in some US states, the ban is still in effect. Despite all the controversy, however, the twins' hard work paid off. In spite of all the bans, Freaks went on to receive praise. Premiere magazine said it was one of the 25 most dangerous movies. Entertainment Weekly pegged it at number 3 of the top 50 cult films of all time. Unfortunately, the praise for Freaks wouldn't surface until many years after its release. In the meantime, the Hilton sisters faced a daunting new challenge. Now that the twins were young women and free from their managers, something inevitable came up that proved to be completely awkward. Daisy was the first of the two to take a lover, but how does that work when your sister is always going to be along for the ride? Violet later said that when her sister was being amorous with her boyfriend, she'd simply turn over, read a book, and eat an apple. Eventually, it was Violet who wanted to make an honest woman of herself. Her boyfriend was musician Maurice Lambert, and the two were more than happy about getting married. They applied for a marriage license, but to their shock and dismay, they got a big fat no. Judges across the country called their love indecent and immoral. Once again, the sisters faced extreme prejudice, and it doomed them to immeasurable heartbreak. In lieu of this rejection, Violet and Lambert eventually broke up, but Violet wasn't ready to give up on marriage altogether. The state finally came around and gave Violet the right to marry. However, when she decided to tie the knot, it wasn't for love. Most people consider her wedding to actor James Moore to be more of a publicity stunt than true love. They believed this for two reasons. The couple charged their guests a 25-cent admission fee, and moreover, the groom was gay. Unsurprisingly, Violet and Moore had the marriage annulled 10 years later, but wedding bells would soon ring again. This time, it would be Daisy's turn. Violet's first taste of marriage had been more than a little sour, but that didn't stop sister Daisy from giving it a try. Unfortunately, there were red flags everywhere. Her groom was the dancer Buddy Sawyer, and he just happened to be gay. This was a recipe for disaster, and only 10 days after the couple said "I do," the marriage was already over. The twins' love lives were messy from top to bottom, but what about their professional lives? By the 1950s, both Daisy and Violet had failed marriages at their backs, and they were in short supply of cash. They were actually pretty desperate and even tried selling fast food for a living. The twins bought a hot dog stand and hoped that their celebrity status would draw customers. The other vendors in the area weren't keen on competing with conjoined twins, but they didn't need to worry. The business failed spectacularly. Following the failure of their hot dog business, the Hilton sisters finally got a big break. The 1952 film Chained for Life actually used the story of the girls' lives as a starting point. The rest of the film was pure fiction, turning their story into a conjoined twin noir thriller. Daisy and Violet thought that they were finally on the right track, but they were so wrong. Unfortunately, critics weren't buying Chained for Life. Changing the sorrowful and often harrowing life story of Daisy and Violet into a thriller didn't impress critics or entice audiences into the theater. Later, Chained for Life even received an unwelcome accolade. It was included in the worst of the worst film festival. Yes, the film was a failure, but that didn't stop Daisy and Violet from throwing themselves into the spotlight. With a disastrous film behind them, the Hilton sisters did what they could to earn money. Instead of trying to remove themselves from any association with the failed film, they did the opposite. They toured the country promoting it. Daisy and Violet happily appeared at double-billed screenings of Chained for Life and their first film, Freaks. These appearances paid, but they didn't pay well. Life was getting harder and harder for Daisy and Violet, and soon they were circling the drain. The Hilton sisters barely managed to get by on the money they earned from public appearances. In 1961, they pulled into Charlotte, North Carolina for an appearance at a drive-in theater. After the appearance, Daisy and Violet just wanted to get their money and leave. The Hilton sisters couldn't locate their manager. It turned out he'd taken off while the two were performing. The heartless reason? The twins weren't bringing good money anymore. There was, however, something even more devastating about this turn of events. Not only was the manager a source of income for Daisy and Violet, but he was also their ride home. The twins had no money and no wheels, so they had to get resourceful and pragmatic. Instead of returning to show business, the twins ended up getting jobs as cashiers at a local grocery store. Once Daisy and Violet had won over the heart of the grocery store owner, he did something rather touching. He designed a counter that would accommodate the two sisters working side by side. This afforded them a very well-deserved rare slice of normalcy. Unfortunately, fate had another cruel twist in store for them. In 1968, there was a bad case of influenza that ripped across the United States. By Christmas time, both Daisy and Violet had caught the virus and suffered a great deal, but it was so much worse than anyone realized. In the new year, the twins didn't show up for work at the grocery store. The store owner became alarmed and called the local authorities, who broke down the Hilton sisters' door. The officers entered the twins' apartment and found their lifeless bodies. The autopsy confirmed what had actually happened during Daisy and Violet's last days on Earth, and it wasn't a pretty picture. It turned out that the twins hadn't passed at the same time. Daisy went first and Violet second. And the most heartbreaking fact of all, Violet laid beside her deceased sister for up to 4 agonizing days before she too fell victim to the flu.
Charles Stratton, aka Tom Thumb, and his wife Lavinia performed in the circus with their babies, but they were also hiding a deranged secret. Charles Stratton didn't inherit his height from his mother or father. Both of his parents were of average stature. They were, however, first cousins. His father, Sherwood Edward Stratton, was a carpenter, while his mother, Cynthia Thompson, was a cleaner. The humble couple was no stranger to life's curveballs. but after they welcomed their son, they experienced their biggest surprise yet. When Charles was born on January 4th, 1838, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was even considered a large baby. But by his first birthday, the Straddons realized something was seriously wrong. Charles hadn't grown in 6 months. At this point, he was only 25 inches tall and weighed 15 pounds. They raced him to the doctor, fearing the worst. The doctor confirmed their fears. It was unlikely that Charles would ever reach adult height. But luckily, there was a silver lining. His body was proportionate and healthy, and, size aside, he was a normal child. Still, his parents couldn't help but worry. After all, how would their little boy be able to thrive in a world that was too big for him? Luckily, word of Charles reached a legend's ears, and his life would never be the same again. When Phineas T. Barnum heard about a tiny child in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the Greatest Showman knew he had to meet this kid. After tracking Charles down, Phineas knew he'd hit the jackpot. He begged the Straddons for their permission to exhibit their 4-year-old son in New York City alongside adults with unusual features. When his parents agreed, the businessman was ecstatic and determined to turn this little boy into a huge star, no matter what. Most 4-year-olds are just learning how to read and write, but our Charles was no ordinary kid. Instead of going to a normal school, he learned everything he'd need to be a star. This included singing, dancing, miming, and even impersonating famous people. Now, with the tools of the trade under his belt, Charles needed a shiny, marketable identity, and Phineas had a perfect idea. Charles Stratton is a perfectly fine name, but it was missing that star quality, at least according to Phineas. But the showman came up with the stage name, General Tom Thumb. He borrowed from English folklore. Tom Thumb was a character who was the size of his father's thumb and got into all kinds of shenanigans. But Phineas still wasn't satisfied. A new name wasn't enough. The showman invented an identity for Charles. He was no longer Charles Stratton, a 4-year-old from Connecticut. To audiences, he was an 11-year-old from England. Even worse, Cynthia, Charles' mother, had no idea until it was too late. She was furious, until the act became a hit and money started rolling in. But General Tom Thumb wasn't just successful because of his backstory or size. Charles had something most of us can only dream of. It didn't take long for Charles to make a big impact. His earliest performances in New York and first national tour, all at only 5 years old, were turning points in freak show entertainment. Thanks to General Tom Thumb, it became one of the most popular types of entertainment. But this success came with a weird problem. Phineas and Charles' competitors saw their success and mountains of money, and they wanted a slice of this ever-growing pie. Their rivals came out with an imitation of General Tom Thumb. It got so bad that newspapers put out warnings about these wannabes. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but Phineas and Charles probably didn't feel this way since the copycats cut into their bottom line. But they had bigger goals than their imitators: global domination. A year later, Phineas and Charles went on a 3-year European tour with dreams of international fame and fortune, but it didn't take long for disappointment to set in. Things weren't looking great until Phineas had a genius realization. Class meant everything in England. They should have been focusing on charming the upper classes. Phineas changed tactics and aggressively networked with the upper class until he landed in an audience with Queen Victoria. While meeting Queen Victoria was a make-or-break moment, Charles went for his usual cheerful and comedic routine. Turns out this was super risky because the royals were still in mourning for Prince Albert's father. But against all odds, it worked, and General Tom Thumb charmed Queen Victoria. He even pretended to defend himself against one of the Queen's yappy dogs. Thanks to her seal of approval, everything changed. Thanks to Queen Victoria and the European tour, General Tom Thumb became the most famous entertainer of his time in the United States and in Europe. Charles couldn't go anywhere without crowds mobbing him, and infamously, many in these crowds were adoring women who wanted a lot more than a glimpse of General Tom. Women waited in line just for a chance to kiss General Tom Thumb, who, as a reminder, is the child Charles Stratton. But it was par for the course for this child star who never had a childhood. To be sold off to the circus is a strange foundation for youth. Losing your childhood to it makes it so much worse. Phineas didn't just lie about Charles' age, he expected the boy to act much older than he actually was. Charles not only spent all his time with adults, but he started drinking at 5 and smoking at 7, all part of the trade-off for wealth beyond Stratton's wildest dreams. Charles wasn't in working-class Connecticut anymore, that's for sure. Thanks to Phineas's management and his own talents, he became extremely wealthy. While Charles had expensive taste, he had the wallet to back it up. Charles owned luxury real estate, the finest clothes, and even a yacht. But most importantly, his wealth played no small role in attracting the love of his life. Enter Lavinia. Mercy Lavinia Bump was a fellow little person, but her life couldn't have been more different than Charles. She had a normal childhood and became a well-respected school teacher. In adulthood, Lavinia chose to turn her normal life upside down after learning about General Tom Thumb. Inspired by her success, she took a risk leaving her stable life and entered the crazy world of entertainment. Phineas ended up managing Lavinia, and now it was only a matter of time before she crossed paths with Charles. According to Phineas, it was love at first sight, at least for Charles. He allegedly said, "Mr. Barnum, that is the most charming little lady I ever saw, and I believe she was created on purpose to be my wife. Now, you have always been a friend of mine, and I want you to say a good word for me to her. I've got plenty of money, and I want to marry and settle down in life, and I really feel as if I must marry that young lady." Charles was now a man on a mission, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in his way. Hoping to impress her, Charles showed Lavinia around his mansion and lavish life, but he didn't stop there. They went around town and toured his many investment properties. It worked. She told Phineas, "It seems as if you and Tom Thumb owned about all of Bridgeport." But Charles had a rival in the battle for her hand in marriage. George Washington Morrison Nutt, or Commodore Nutt, had a lot in common with Charles. They were both little people, entertainers, and part of Phineas's company. And they were both in love with the same woman, Lavinia. Lavinia, however, was older than Charles and never saw him as anything more than a nice little boy. Unfortunately, Phineas accidentally made their love triangle even more complicated. Phineas gifted Lavinia a diamond and emerald ring, but it didn't fit. The showman suggested she gift the ring to George. It was supposed to be a token of her friendship. Instead, George viewed it as a token and declaration of her love. Charles wanted Phineas to support him instead of George, and knew exactly how to make this happen. Charles promised if the showman helped him marry Lavinia, he'd have a public wedding. Basically, he promised to make Phineas even richer. With dollar signs in his eyes, the showman convinced Lavinia to consider Charles. Unsurprisingly, George didn't exactly take this betrayal lightly. The love triangle between Lavinia, Charles, and George reached its climax in one of the most dramatic ways. According to Phineas, George and Charles didn't just disagree over who had the right to court Lavinia, their rivalry escalated into a physical fight at work over her. The showman claims George started it by throwing Charles onto the floor, but that was only the beginning. When George arrived at Phineas's house one night, his heart sank. Charles and Lavinia were spending time alone in a parlor. Charles had proposed and Lavinia had said yes. George felt as though Phineas and Charles betrayed him in the worst way. He struggled to forgive them for their dastardly offenses. Regardless of how George felt, the show and wedding must go on. The dramatics didn't stop there. In fact, a blackmailer disrupted their wedding planning. A woman threatened to publish unflattering things about Charles and Lavinia. However, nobody batted an eye. Phineas even dared her, "You may print 100,000 copies." To the showman, there was no such thing as bad publicity. In 1863, Charles married Lavinia in New York City. The wedding was many things, but intimate it was not. The newlyweds even stood on top of a grand piano to greet their 10,000 guests. The maid of honor was Minnie Warren, Lavinia's sister and fellow little person, which was to be expected. Charles' best man was George, certainly less so. Charles had promised to make Phineas a fortune from his wedding. They even sold tickets to the reception for $75, roughly $1,800 today, and yet it still sold out. Charles and Lavinia reached even greater heights of fame and fortune after marrying, if that's even possible. Their American fans couldn't help but be enthralled by the newlyweds, especially to distract themselves from the horrors of their own nation. 1863 wasn't just the year Charles and Lavinia married, it was also right in the middle of the Civil War. Amazingly, Their wedding knocked the conflict off the New York Times front page for 3 whole days. After all, the wedding and their story provided much-needed escapism for a conflict-weary nation. But Charles and Lavinia couldn't charm everyone. Most Americans viewed Charles and Lavinia's wedding and story as a fairy tale, but others were not so convinced. Some cynics believed that this was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Charles responded furiously. He responded, "We are simply man and woman of like passions and infirmities with you and other mortals. The arrangements for our marriages are controlled by no showman." But the offensiveness of these cynics paled in comparison to the nosy Nellies. During the pair's grand tours, even President Lincoln held a reception for them at the White House. It was an interesting scene. The newlyweds were famously short, while Lincoln was famously tall, but the legendary politician made them feel more than welcome. When someone rudely asked Charles, "They call you General, do they?" the president interjected, "I wish my generals were as good a general as he is." Charles soon found out the hard way that there were 3 participants in his relationship. This time, it wasn't pesky George, it was his fame and the annoying fans that came with it. The newlyweds felt like an army of curiosity mongers were always breathing down their necks. Fame was a double-edged sword, and they learned this the hard way over and over again. Charles and Lavinia were magnets for criminals who thought they would be easy victims, especially on their many tours. On one memorable occasion, 2 robbers stalked them. Luckily, the authorities stopped them in the nick of time, but the newlyweds weren't always so lucky. Another time, they found a ton of money missing from their hotel room. Turns out, a maid had swiped it, but the girl was so distraught, the couple took mercy on her and didn't press charges. The wedding had lifted Charles and Lavinia's reputations to new heights, but they, including Phineas, wanted more. During their appearances, Charles and Lavinia started showing up with babies that everyone assumed were theirs. This addition to their story made the pair even more popular. Eventually, Phineas claimed that the child had passed, but this was all an elaborate ruse. Lavinia later confessed they rented babies from hospitals and orphanages. It seemed like yet another tall tale, or was it? It gets even weirder. Charles and Lavinia may have actually had a child after all. Centuries later, a historian discovered evidence suggesting that the child wasn't just a hoax. But why would Lavinia randomly confess to lying? Frustratingly, this may always remain an unsolved mystery. That said, starting a family wasn't Charles and Lavinia's only problem. Phineas marketed Charles and Lavinia as childlike because sympathy sold tickets, but this came at a big cost. The 2 performers were adults, accomplished and brilliant, but people infantilized them and crossed boundaries. Fans even wanted to pet and hold Lavinia. She raged. It seemed impossible to make people understand at first that I was not a child, that, being a woman, I had the womanly instinct of shrinking from a form of familiarity which in case of a child of my size would have been as natural as it was permissible. And that was only the tip of the iceberg. In January 1883, Charles and Lavinia were fast asleep in the room at the Newhall house when a frantic and loud knocking woke Charles. He groggily opened the door to an officer who raced inside. In an instant, he was wide awake. He realized fire surrounded the room. Charles and Lavinia found themselves in the heat of the Newhall house fire, one of the worst hotel fires in American history. They realized with dawning horror that the only way out was the window. The officer frantically opened the window and screamed for a ladder. Wearing only his pajamas, Charles climbed his way down to safety. The officer, holding Lavinia, followed. They survived, but 71 unfortunate souls were not so lucky. Lavinia was beyond grateful that they survived, but realized Charles wasn't exactly on the same page. Surrounded by destruction and suffering, he complained about all the luxury items he lost. Shocked and disgusted, Lavinia scolded him. "So what if we have lost everything? Look at those people there." Lavinia then proved she literally was his better half by helping fellow survivors out. Charles may have survived the fire, but he wouldn't be so lucky next time. While the infantilizing marketing continued, Charles aged rapidly and badly. For example, his skin didn't just wrinkle, it yellowed. He gained a lot of weight and even a little height. A newspaper even wrote that Charles looked like an orange that had been sat upon. Most people would have called it quits at this point, but Charles couldn't bring himself to. Why wouldn't Charles retire after struggling with his health and securing his fame and fortune? You see, Charles was addicted to the limelight. He admitted, "I can't do without the excitement of public life." After all, his life, as crazy as it was the only one he'd ever known. Tragically, Charles would never experience the peace and serenity of retirement. On July 15th, 1883, Charles woke up tired but otherwise fine in his Middleborough mansion. It was supposed to be another normal day. He chatted with his brother-in-law, Edward. Immediately after Edward left, he heard a loud noise, as if something heavy dropped on the floor. He ran back and found Charles lifeless on the floor. It was a stroke. This was barely 6 months after the Newhall house fire. Charles was 45 years old. Lavinia wasn't with him. Charles' stature was the only small thing about him. Everything else, larger than life. He lived the life of 100 men. He'd achieved enormous fame, fortune, and success. This included a huge wedding. Its funeral was no different and saw over 20,000 attendees. Phineas even commissioned a life-size statue to stand forever at his dear friend's gravestone. Charles left behind a mourning wife who was about to get another unpleasant surprise. Lavinia planned to retire but realized she couldn't. Turns out she couldn't afford to. While Charles and Lavinia earned mountains of money, they spent too much, especially Charles. Sadly, Lavinia resorted to selling many of her most prized belongings, including her wedding gifts and jewelry. The widow continued to work, and that's where she crossed paths with her next lover. 2 years after Charles' passing, Lavinia married again. This time it was to Count Primo Magri, an Italian and fellow little person. Count wasn't just a stage name. Primo claimed he was actually a count. Unfortunately, this title didn't come with any wealth, and so the newlyweds had to work at their famous roadside show. On paper, it appears as though Lavinia had moved on, but as it turns out, she never got over Charles. On November 25th, 1919, Lavinia passed at 78. She outlived Charles by 33 years. Her second husband outlived her by a year, which makes her burial situation even more interesting. You see, Lavinia is buried next to Charles, but all she got was a gravestone that reads, "His wife." Unfortunately, Charles continued to be a magnet for criminals even well after his passing. In 1959, some hooligans senselessly destroyed the statue by his grave. Fortunately, the local community eventually restored the statue and grave to their former glory. And decades later, his legacy is certainly still more than that. Countless films and actors portrayed and immortalized Charles on film. Most notably, he was a character in the 2017 musical film The Greatest Showman. The film ended up a massive production that raked in $415 million alongside its star-studded cast. And most importantly, Sam Humphrey, an actor with skeletal dysplasia, played Charles, history's most famous little person with a legacy that looms larger than life. Despite the challenges he faced, being thrust into the spotlight as a child, living under constant scrutiny, and navigating the highs and lows of an extraordinary career, Charles left an indelible mark on history. He transformed public perceptions of little people, proving that talent, wit, and charisma could outshine even the harshest prejudices. His life, though tragically cut short, remains a poignant reminder of both the allure and cost of the limelight. Today we remember General Tom Thumb not just as a performer, but as a man whose ambition and spirit allowed him to rise above adversity. His story continues to inspire, reminding us that no matter how small we may feel in the world, our impact can be anything but.
Conjoined twins Eng and Chang Bunker faced constant exploitation, but their final horror show began when Chang fell ill, and one morning, Eng woke up to find his brother dead. Still tethered to him, his response was utterly disturbing. Chang and Eng Bunker led extraordinary lives. Born as conjoined twins, they lived in poverty in Siam before coming to the West to be showcased as freaks. And even though they ultimately found success as the famous Siamese twins, it was never easy. They endured great prejudice, exploitation, and an incredible loss of their bodily autonomy. Still, they eventually found their voices and soared up the American social ladder. but at what cost? As one could imagine, the twins' debut into the world was a bit of a shocker. Chang and Eng were born on May 11, 1811, in Siam, which is now Thailand, to their mother Nok and their father, a Chinese fisherman named Ti. Although their mother claimed that their birth wasn't any more laborious than those of her other children, the sight of the twins reportedly horrified the midwives. Distressingly, both Chang and Eng were connected at their sternums by a band of flesh. Even worse, the band was twisted, forcing the infants into a dangerous face-to-face position. Fortunately, while the midwives were presumably busy staring at each other in confusion, Nok's instincts kicked in, and she did something jaw-dropping. In a move that likely saved the twins' lives, she reportedly untwisted their band, which connected to just one umbilical cord, and repositioned the twins so they could instead lay staring into each other's eyes. Still, there were more challenges to come. Nok was adamant that her babies would live regular lives, so, as Chang and Eng grew older, she urged them to exercise to try to stretch their connection, and as a result, their band eventually extended just long enough to allow them to walk alongside each other. After that, there was no stopping them. The twins were energetic, happy-go-lucky kids who endlessly ran around and played with their friends. But sadly, the joys of their youth were short-lived. Chang and Eng's carefree childhood all but came to an abrupt end when a smallpox epidemic hit their community hard in 1819. Although both boys caught the sickness and miraculously survived, their father, Ti, wasn't nearly as lucky. He died from the illness when they were only 8 years old. Because Ti was the household's breadwinner, Chang and Eng's family struggled financially without him. Unfortunately, their mother's solution to the problem was devastating. You see, shortly after they lost their father, the twins somehow wound up employed in the cocoa bean oil industry. But remember, they were just 8 years old when their dad passed, meaning that by today's standards at least, these poor tykes were working as child laborers. After a few years, Chang and Eng abandoned the oil business to help their mother raise ducks for eggs and travel as merchants. Then, a chance encounter changed their prospects forever. While out for a sunset swim in a river in 1824, the twins accidentally scared the pants off a Scottish merchant named Robert Hunter, who was floating in a fishing boat nearby. At first, the wide-eyed merchant assumed he'd just seen some sort of strange animal swimming in the river. However, Robert quickly realized his mistake upon meeting the conjoined twins and discovering that the boys were actually human after all. Then, Robert's previously startled eyes suddenly turned into dollar signs. For Robert, his serendipitous encounter with the conjoined twins must have felt like winning the lottery. Imagine the riches he could fetch with them. Of course, it took Robert almost no effort at all to convince the nearly destitute Chang and Eng of their potential worth. Although Chang and Eng agreed to the too good to be true proposition straight away, the twins weren't the only ones Robert had to persuade, and naturally, Nok didn't want to let her sons go. To help put everyone's minds at ease, Robert proposed that they all sign a contract stating that Chang and Eng's tour would be limited to 5 years. Robert also offered Nok $500 to financially compensate for the loss of income she'd have to endure due to the absence of her twins. It did the trick. Feeling more reassured, they all signed the contract together, and then it was a done deal. Eventually, the king of Siam became aware of Chang and Eng's unique existence and immediately forbade them from leaving the country. However, the reason why isn't clear. According to Robert, the king ordered Chang and Eng to remain in Siam because he ultimately intended to execute them. It took Robert and his American sea captain partner Abel Coffin 5 long years to persuade the monarch. On April 1st, 1829, Chang and Eng, now 17 years old, finally boarded a trading vessel to Boston, Massachusetts. Though the trip was grueling, 138 days to be exact, the twins kept busy along the way by learning English, and when they finally landed on August 16th, they were in for a shock. They arrived to a media storm intent on hyping them up. It all started the very next day when the Boston Patriot reported that the conjoined twins would probably be exhibited to the public. A lot of the articles viewed the twins through a sensationalized and, well, prejudiced lens. In fact, most of the articles were wrought with ethnic stereotypes and even outright lies about them. Robert and Abel promptly hired a manager named James W. Hale to help get the twins' exhibit going. Before long, American gawkers could gaze upon the wonder that was the Siamese double boys for a mere 25 cents, though Chang and Eng actually preferred to be called the Siamese youths. James even ensured that pamphlets or drawings of the twins would be available for their audiences to purchase as souvenirs. Excitingly, their show started to gain traction. However, it wasn't exactly in good taste. Apparently, someone at some point lost sight of the fact that it was Chang and Eng's conjoined status and not their ethnicity that was supposed to be their primary audience pull. Regardless, the show seemed to be purposely exploit and capitalize on the twins' Asian background by dressing them in oriental garb and styling their hair into pigtails to accentuate their exoticness. For 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, Chang and Eng displayed themselves as public curiosities at various theaters and venues across the United States. Although showcasing their physical connection always remained a key feature of their exhibit, the duo soon took to performing parlor tricks, acrobatics, and feats of strength. Unique as they were, Chang and Eng became an instant hit. Following the success of their show, Chang and Eng quickly drew the medical community's attention. Before long, some of the greatest doctors in America began gathering to see the twins for themselves, and upon realizing that the brothers were the real deal, they begged for permission to examine them. The doctors were practically drooling over Chang and Eng because at the time, few conjoined twins ever survived into adulthood. Yet, here they were, the shiniest of medical marvels. With their connecting band now approximately the size of a child's arm, Eng stood at 5 foot 2 inches tall, while Chang, who was attached to Eng's left arm from their perspective, was an inch shorter than his brother and wore lifts in his shoes to keep from pulling Eng down. Even though Chang and Eng earned a profit from all their performances, Abel Coffin supposedly once boasted to a group of people that he and Robert Hunter owned them, thereby signaling that he probably didn't care very much about the twins' personal rights and freedoms. Especially since, as it turned out, the doctor's offers actually piqued his interest for one majorly selfish reason. The twins' handlers wanted to use the medical community's seal of approval to bolster the show even further. Such ringing medical endorsements came at the expense of the twins' bodily autonomy. In time, Chang and Eng grew so popular that their handlers decided to take their show overseas. In 1830, the twins set sail to meet their British audiences, and also, unfortunately, meet with British doctors. Nevertheless, their trip was a success, and by the time they returned to New York in March of 1831, they'd turned a large profit. By this point, the twins were older, wealthier, and much more experienced in the biz, and they were finally starting to find their voices. Whether that factored into what happened next is unclear, but one thing remains for certain. Chang and Eng's initial supporter, Robert Hunter, called it quits. He sold his portion of the show to Abel Coffin and then walked away for good. It was the beginning of a downward spiral for the twins. That summer, while out for a hunting retreat with their manager, a group of more than a dozen local men randomly approached Chang and Eng. Believing that the men were there to mock and imitate him, the situation quickly flew out of hand when one of the twins suddenly used the butt of their firearm to hit a man named Elbridge Gary. Elbridge responded by grabbing a large rock and heaving it toward the twins, hitting one of them in the head. With one twin now bleeding, Chang and Eng fired back at him with their weapon, though thankfully their shot turned out to be a blank. Even so, it was enough to scare the locals. They scattered. Somehow, the media caught wind of the brawl between the twins and the townspeople, with the Salem Mercury and other news outlets initially characterizing Chang and Eng as the victims. But Elbridge Gary wasn't having it. 2 weeks after the incident, Elbridge penned an open letter titled "To the Public" that got published in the press, claiming it was the twins, not him, who'd started the fight. When their manager at the time learned that the incident could potentially tarnish the twins' prestige, the consequences were devastating. He hit the roof and quit. Fortunately, James's successor turned out to be his friend, Charles Harris, whom he could advise with all sorts of helpful hints. As Chang and Eng struggled to deal with the fallout from their last incident, a whole new controversy erupted. In the middle of a performance in Alabama, yet another physician demanded that Chang and Eng Bunker allow him to examine their connecting band. But this time, Chang and Eng said no. Rather than respecting Chang and Eng's wishes, the doctor became enraged and screamed, "You are all a bunch of pickpockets and imposters." He then incited an uproar, causing audience members to throw things at the twins from across the room. Once again, the twins were in hot water. Officials needed someone to blame for the mayhem, and it wasn't about to be the jolly old doctor. Chang and Eng's rapid exit off the stage made them appear extremely guilty in the eyes of the law. So for the second time that year, the twins wound up paying a good behavior bond. Then, just like after the last incident, yet another close relationship of theirs broke down. Abel Coffin frequently traveled, leaving his wife, Susan, responsible for the twins, and Susan was a total nightmare. In fact, Susan rapidly became a source of great distress for the twins, as she tended to neglect their needs, even rejecting their pleas for an extra $3 a week so they could afford to feed their horse. Growing desperate, Chang and Eng eventually begged their manager, Charles Harris, to intervene, hoping that he'd write letters to Susan on their behalf. After some initial reluctance, Charles finally agreed. Still, his letters didn't help, for one blood-boiling reason. Even though Chang and Eng perceived their business with the Coffins as a partnership of equals, the Coffins only ever saw the twins as their subordinates. Indeed, the Coffins forced the twins to perform when they were unwell, care for Susan whenever Abel was away, and once, while traveling, the Coffins even booked the twins into steerage as servants, and lied to their faces about it. Needless to say, Chang and Eng were utterly miserable, so they began plotting their exit strategy. Because Abel once guaranteed the twins could be their own men when they turned 21, Chang and Eng became 100% determined to be free of the Coffins forever the moment they reached adulthood. But there was a problem. Abel had set sail for Asia in 1831, with plans to come back to America in January, and he still hadn't yet returned by the time the twins' 21st birthday rolled around in May. So, desperate for their freedom, Chang and Eng took drastic measures. Increasingly anxious at the thought that if Abel never came back, they'd be stuck working for the Coffins forever, Chang and Eng decided to split, rather unceremoniously. As a result, when Abel Coffin finally did return to Massachusetts in July of 1832, it shocked him to his core to learn that Chang and Eng had left. With his prized cash cows on the run, Abel went nuts. He even falsely accused the twins' former manager, James Hale, of exciting his subjects to rebellion, which I doubt James appreciated. After a frantic search, Abel eventually located the twins in New York, where he supposedly found them gambling and drinking. Abel confessed to James that when he finally found Chang and Eng, he flew into a disturbing rage. He proceeded to give them the biggest thrashing they had ever had in their lives, which definitely isn't the way to go when you're trying to win your friends back. Sure enough, the twins refused to return with Abel. Interestingly, Abel later downplayed the entire encounter with the twins in a letter to his wife, writing, "We had much talk. They seemed to feel themselves quite free from me." And free they were. Now that Chang and Eng had finally regained control of their lives, they could finally run their show the way they wanted. In a bit of a shake-up, they contracted their own crew, began dressing in American attire, and they even took to conversing with their audiences in English. Perhaps most tellingly, they stopped presenting themselves as boys, and instead began referring to themselves as the Siamese twins. Chang and Eng met their neighbors, the Yates family, shortly after establishing their farm, and their gaze quickly fell on two of the Yates daughters, Sarah and Adelaide. While Sarah was allegedly the simple and more fair one, Adelaide, who excelled in personal beauty, was younger, taller, and thinner than Sarah, and was also said to have more refined taste. To Chang and Eng, it seemed like a match made in heaven. But alas, love can be complicated. The Bunker's courtship of the Yates sisters was unusually dramatic, because both Chang and Eng fell in love with Sarah, tossing poor Adelaide aside to kick rocks. Of course, despite their unique circumstance, the two brothers couldn't possibly marry the same woman, so Chang eventually settled for Adelaide. Or maybe Sarah just liked Eng better, who knows. Either way, the twins soon announced their intentions to wed. The happy couples declared their intent to marry by riding in an open wagon together. It should have been the happiest moment of their lives. But instead, it turned into a nightmare. The media insulted them, the entire town flew into a tizzy, and a few local men even went as far as to shatter the Yates windows the night before the wedding. They even threatened to destroy the Yates crops if Sarah and Adelaide's father refused to manage his daughters. It must have felt like the world was against them, but it didn't matter. On April 13, 1843, Chang and Eng Bunker married Adelaide and Sarah Yates. While they all shared a home at first, and a colossal bed, the twins eventually built 2 separate houses for their respective families and traded off between them every 3 days. As a whole, the number of Chang and Eng's children could have filled an entire classroom. Their first babies arrived just 6 days apart, with Sarah giving birth on February 10, 1844, and then Adelaide on February 16. Chang and Adelaide had 10 children together, while Eng and Sarah had 11. Chang and Eng both had huge families to support, and despite their many business ventures, it started to look more and more like they'd have to come out of their semi-retirement from the exhibition industry. So, the twins resumed touring, and eventually featured their own children in their acts. They also scored a brief contract with P.T. Barnum, which undoubtedly gave them a nice boost as well. Chang and Eng quickly found themselves in dire straits when the Civil War ended in 1865. A lot of their money was in Confederate currency, which was now worthless.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
Now suddenly, down a good chunk of their money and unable to run their farmland alone, the twins would again have to showcase themselves as freaks to make ends meet. At this time, they were just 2 elderly men with large families to support. Needless to say, their performance didn't elicit a whole lot of compassion from the crowds. Then, to make matters even worse, the unthinkable happened. Unhappy, Chang promptly took to drinking, heavily. Then, 4 years later, Chang's health deteriorated even further when he caught bronchitis in January of 1874. Concerned, their doctor advised the twins to remain indoors to allow Chang to heal. Except, the twins had an agreement to switch houses every 3 days. On January 15th, the Bunker brothers made the trek through the wintry cold from Chang's house to Eng's house. Sadly, it was a fatal mistake. Though Chang's health appeared to improve the next day, his breathing had become so much more difficult by the evening that the twins had to spend the night resting upright in a chair by the fireplace. However, this was uncomfortable for Eng, who was having trouble sleeping, so he requested that they return to their bed. Then, the following morning, one of Eng's sons woke him with the devastating news. Chang had died. And understandably, Eng panicked. Upon hearing the horrifying news that his twin brother was gone, Eng's response was heartbreaking. He cried, "Then I am going." And for the next hour, he suffered in great agony and misery. He broke into a cold sweat, and at one point, he even moved Chang's body to be closer to him. Although the family quickly sent for a doctor, Eng died on January 17th, a little over 2 hours after Chang passed. They were 62. But still, the brothers couldn't be left in peace. The public demanded an autopsy after learning of Chang and Eng's passing, and the autopsy results, while scientifically fascinating, were also incredibly heartbreaking. While the autopsy results revealed various facts about the twins' condition, including that they shared a liver through their connecting band, they also disclosed what ultimately ended their lives. Distressingly, the examination showed that while Chang passed from a cerebral blood clot, Eng's subsequent demise wasn't actually the result of any physical ailment. Despite alternate theories, Eng likely passed from the brutally intense shock of having his worst nightmare realized, remaining connected to his deceased twin brother. What a horrible way to go.